Bene, buonasera a tutti, ciao a tutti, siamo arrivati all'ultimo talk dei Torino Graphic Days, siamo quasi alla fine, noi siamo stanchissimi, spero però che insomma, lo sforzo che abbiamo fatto in questi giorni sia in qualche modo passato anche a voi che siete stati numerosi in questo festival. A dispetto di tutti i precedenti talk non sarò io a fare gli onori di casa e per questo motivo invito qui di fianco a me Massimo Pitis, che è fondatore di Pitis Associati e direttore artistico di Guardia d'Italia. Massimo è già stato qui ieri facendo il suo talk, quest'oggi fa da moderatore in questo panel d'eccezione, quindi io cedo a lui il microfono e mi faccio da parte.
Grazie. Intanto comincerò a parlare in inglese perché il talk sarà in inglese, quindi forse la cosa migliore è cominciare da subito. I think that Britain wins here because this is totally Monty Python kind of mix. Anyway, so we're going to talk about magazine design. I was saying tonight, but it's this afternoon. And I will just briefly introduce the people on the sofas. And then I will let them introduce themselves with a very brief presentation. The main goal is to have a chat about what magazine design and magazines, paper magazine mostly, are today, but also we talk about digital and whatever we want because we are free for 2 hours to do it. And you are free as well to make questions. And this will be much more interesting if you will interact with us a lot. Normally it doesn't happen much during these meetings because normally you're afraid, mostly the students I mean, are normally afraid to approach someone on this side of the meeting, but I will strongly invite you to interact with us. That would make a much better discussion. Anyway, so today we have here Ben Freeman, which is a publisher and designer, and he will tell us later what he does. He lives in England, and his main work is starting from England, but also outside in Europe. Jeremy Leslie, which is creative director at Mac Culture. I think and I hope you know what it is, but anyway, he will give you a full presentation of his work. And Francesco Franchi is the third person on the stage, and as an Italian, and you probably know him more than the others, but is the creative director at Robinson of Repubblica, and he's been the creative director of IL, so you probably know his work very well anyway. But he will update you with all the new things that he's doing, okay? And I am art director of Wired Magazine as Christian. That's okay, I'm old, I forget names. Anyway, Christian said, and I will, at the end, just show you a very brief showreel of the new Wired Italia, but it will be just 5 minutes. Okay? Let's start. Ben, you want to start first?
Hi everyone. I'm English, so if I speak too fast, you can wave at me and I'll slow down. So I tend to speak quite fast anyway. Great. Thank you. So it's good to be here. My name's Ben Freeman, and I mainly run a publishing company called Ditto. We're based in London, and we're an independent publisher. So I just thought I'd tell you a little bit briefly about how I got started with independent publishing, and show you some of the projects I do now, but obviously we haven't got a huge amount of time, so it's just an overview. I started off making fanzines, I guess, when I was 11 years old, so in 1989, and I'm now 39, and in that time, I've never really stopped making independent publications. This was the first thing I did really kind of semi-professionally, I guess. It was called Fun Magazine, and this was when I studied graphic design. Then I decided I didn't want to be a graphic designer, and then I went to the Royal College of Art, and I sort of rediscovered my love of independent publishing. Fun Magazine was just a free fanzine, and we printed quite a lot, like 5,000, 8,000, and we had them distributed internationally, but it was a free thing. So really it was just a platform for us to do the journalism we wanted to do. And you know, with this, I did all the sort of design and creative direction and commissioned all the illustration, and it was kind of all of the things that I really wanted to read about, but I couldn't see in the world of publishing. So we did 6 issues of Fun magazine. It was always free. The last 3 actually became kind of proper printed, saddle-stitched magazines, and they were like 64 pages, no adverts, so it became quite a lot of content. And it was basically, you know, a proper magazine, just kind of disguised as a fanzine. And I really loved doing this. You know, if I could have done this forever, I would have done, but obviously there's no money in a free magazine with no advertising, so I had to get a job at some point. Then I worked a little bit for Vice magazine about 10 years ago when it was about 4 people, and now it's about 4 million people, and it's owned by a big mega corporation. But at the time, they just let me do everything. So I went and did photography and journalism and edited things and did some art direction. It was really, really fun. But mostly I learned about kind of, you know, how publishing works in the real world, you know, with magazines, I guess. I really enjoyed working with the editor at the time called Andy Kappa, who's not there anymore. But they gave me loads of freedom. So I went and, you know, I did reports on mass graves in Slovenia and Satanist cults and paramilitaries in Belfast and sort of extremism in London. And that top one was about a shoe shop. And yeah, it was really fun. I was taking photos as well at the time, so this is some of my photography that went into Vice magazine. So I was kind of writing and taking the photos and, you know, doing all of it. And this was a book that I did at the Royal College. This was kind of the most serious thing I've ever done, and it was about mass graves in Slovenia. And I spent about 2 years working on this. This is like a serious piece of documentary journalism and reportage. And I enjoyed it so much, I enjoyed all of this stuff so much, that I decided to start a publishing company. I thought, have you all heard of risograph machines? So when I started Ditto, there was one company in the world doing risograph printing, and it was in Holland, and it was called Extrapool. And I knew them, and I knew the process, and I thought it would be, you know, good if it was more accessible. So we bought a risograph machine and became the second sort of commercial riso printer in the world. And it obviously became a big thing after that. This is Ditto. It started as a printing and publishing company. We would print things for other people, they would pay us, and then we would use that money to publish our own things. The reality is that we ended up printing loads and loads and loads and loads for other people and didn't have time to do much for ourselves because that's just what happened. And printing is stressful. And I never really wanted to be a printer. I just thought it would be like a tool, like a publishing tool. Actually, it just became, you know, a big thing. And obviously, I didn't anticipate risograph becoming as much of a thing as it did. This is sort of early days. We had a gallery and a print studio, and we used to be called Ditto Press. This is 2 of our most popular books. The left one's called Skinhead and Archive, and the right one is called Ninja Turtle Sex Museum. The left one is a sort of serious like archive of skinhead ephemera, and it's really, really internationally successful. This is a sort of comic redrawing of a gay magazine from the 80s using corpses and Ninja Turtles, and we sell absolutely thousands of these things. So these kind of keep us going, and in between those we published about 40 other publications. I'm also the art director for the Mush Pit, which is a sort of, it's like a satirical feminist fanzine, and I've known the girls, there are 2 editors, and I've been friends with them since they were teenagers. And it started as a fanzine and became like a proper glossy fashion magazine, but kept all of the energy of being a fanzine. And I only art directed the last 2 issues, but the idea was to kind of keep all the sort of really, I don't really know how to say it in simple English, but it's very, very anarchic and very cynical and very funny, and there's nothing else really, in my eyes, doing that at the moment. So I just, when they asked me to art direct it, it was a bit of a joke between friends, and I said, no, let's do it properly. So it became this kind of, this is a story we did with Corinne Day's archive and Vinka Peterson, so I did all these collages and art direction, and this is a sort of proper fashion photo shoot that we did with Eloise Parry. And on, you know, I could talk endlessly about the magazines and books that I've produced and art directed and been involved in. Really, publishing is the center of everything. But then alongside that, I also do art direction for fashion. So this is one of my main clients, Dilara Findikolu. And she's a Turkish kind of insane psychedelic goth metal fan fashion designer, and we just, you know, we worked on one photo shoot together and just clicked, and we've been working together ever since. So it's not publishing at all, but it uses all of the same influences that I use in the publications we do. So I do her campaigns and her labels, and we did this Marilyn Manson campaign, and that's her last catwalk show. That's some more clothing we did. So I just basically do the sort of typography and graphics, and this is the last show we did. She got into very, very big trouble for doing this show in a church and got told that, you know, told it was a Satanist occult thing, and got loads of hate mail. I mean, it's all quite kind of, it's just aesthetics, you know. And now we're working on a comic, so we've turned her into a superhero called Dilara Warrior Princess, and we've made this whole comic, and that's being released in about 3 weeks. So yeah, like I said, I mean, that's just an overview of the stuff I do, you know, but some fashion art direction, some publishing, and lots of kind of anarchic magazine stuff. Thanks.
Thank you. I didn't know about the comics. Now I introduce to you Jeremy Leslie, Mac Culture, and I leave the floor to him to present himself.
Good afternoon. First of all, a huge thank you to Massimo for inviting me to come and take part in this, and the organisers of Torino Graphic Days for hosting this event around magazines. Right. Yeah, I want to look there. So I'm going to tell you a bit about mag culture and what we've been doing there. First of all, I mean, I trained as a graphic designer, so my background is design, and in particular editorial design. So we have a design studio. We have the online journal. We write and post reviews and opinions and ideas about thinking about magazines online. We try and get at least one post up every day. That's on magculture.com. And then most recently, a couple of years ago, we opened a shop to sell the magazines that we write about. Those are the three main elements of what we do. Then they're all kind of pointing the wrong way. Okay. They're all linked together by a number of other things we do, including design consultancy with publishers. We run events, we create exhibitions and other things, and I do quite a bit of writing about the subject in the creative press. What brings those all together is that we love magazines, and that's the line that we use across everything that we do. I'm not going to go into I haven't got time to go into too much depth. Hopefully the discussion will illustrate that. But suffice to say that the reason I am so passionate and believing in magazines is that I think that they are the core of graphic design practice. It's where graphic design came from, and it's where graphic design always goes back to. I'm just going to. This is the first magazine I used to buy regularly, and I just want to illustrate one key part about magazines and hopefully inform the discussion later. The New Musical Express was a weekly music magazine in the UK. I used to buy it every week on my way to school, and that was the thing that taught me what was going on in my world of music. It was the only source. There were, of course, at that age, there was no internet, but also the mainstream press wasn't covering anything that they were interested, that they were covering. It was the only source I could find out about. I could read interviews by the people I was interested in. Importantly, it was the only place I could find out where the bands I was interested in were actually playing, and it was where I could see the adverts for the records that I wanted to buy. It was absolutely central to my social life around the age of 16, 17, 18. And I would swing by the kiosk every Thursday morning and pick a copy up, except sometimes they'd have run out, and I had to buy this magazine, which is, you can see, what I'm talking about here is content, of course. The design, as you can see, is pretty basic, and it's very similar to the other magazine, but this was not the magazine I wanted. It had the same stuff in it, the same stories, the same news, but it had a completely different character. And the way I portray it is that enemy was my friend and sounds was an acquaintance. if that makes sense in Italian, if you understand that. So this was what drew me to magazines in the first place. Subsequently, I worked on a number of titles, including Blitz, the early Star Mag. I was art director there. I was art director at Time Out magazine. There's a couple of covers I did, typographic covers. I spent the first 10 years of this decade working at a big publishers where I was responsible for a team of about 30 designers, and we produce all sorts of different magazines for clients. And I just show you these just to highlight what I was proudest of in terms of the projects we were doing, is that they didn't look alike. There were all sorts of aesthetics, all sorts of designs going on, and that's the way I like to work. I don't have a singular kind of way of portraying stuff. It's what has to be. It has to be right for the reader and the audience that you're addressing. And to draw attention to two magazines we were making then at the time. On the right was Sky magazine, which you have Sky in this country, a big satellite broadcast. That at the time was the biggest magazine in the UK. We were printing 7 million copies every month, and they were posted to every subscriber of Sky. And of course it was very brash, commercial, used all the commercial kind of newsstand type techniques, celebrity, big names, numbers. But I was still proud of the approach within the scheme of that in terms of what we were doing design-wise. It had to do a job. It had to address its audience. On the left was Carlos, which was a far more aesthetically pleasing and interesting project to work on in terms of it being a kind of fanzine for the Virgin Atlantic flyer. And you can see that both totally, I mean, Carlos didn't have any photography. It was all black and white and purely illustrated. So two very different magazines, but absolutely appropriate for their relative markets. This is another magazine that spurred me off into a lot of what I'm doing now. This was for a paper company called MReal, who I think are now called Sappi. And this was a series about magazines, addressing people working in magazines. It didn't have a name, and it just had the diagonal lines in the top left-hand corner. That was the logo and the identifier. Each issue had a theme, and that was on the belly band that was wrapped around the middle. So we had one about design, about the reader, and about success. These were the covers. Yesterday in Sasha's presentation we had a great exposition about grids and the use of grids in editorial design. For this magazine, the grid was based on those two oblongs there. That was the only grid that we used. The yellow and the eye. That was the shape for the grid. So we used it in to make graphic shapes and graphic blocks. This was a conversation between Eric Spiekermann and the British art director Scott King that got increasingly frenetic as it went on, and we expressed that in the design. Here again, you can see the grid shape running through. And this really interests me, the idea of bringing all the elements together, whether it's photography, whether it's live, still life photography, or reportage photography, or illustration, or other elements, is bringing them all together, and coming up with some pretty busy, complex designs, but hopefully everything on the page is there for a very specific reason. It's not pure just decoration. The first time Mag Culture appeared was on the cover of a book that I published in 2003, which was an overview of the magazine design at the time. Off the back of that, I downloaded a copy of WordPress, a really early theme here for WordPress. So this is the beginning of the Mag Culture website. It's now a bit more sophisticated looking. This is where we're publishing. So the idea, there's a 6-story grid on the front page, which largely kind of covers a week. So every week you can see the whole week's postings. And then in terms moving into this kind of more current times, I've been doing quite a lot of digital work, including the identity and web design for Aeon, which is a very successful online platform. Did do some iPad apps. I think we all did some iPad apps, but I don't think we're doing any now. A recent magazine called Fair, as you know. 4 covers for that. A little wine magazine called Noble Rot looked like this, and we introduced a new logo and but kept the kind of general feel, but made it a little more professional. The people behind this have just opened a restaurant and bar, a wine bar in London, and they kept the logo for that as well. And then the other big kind of piece of work I'm doing at the moment is I'm creative director at a company called Maison Moderne, who are a publisher in Luxembourg. We produce a lot of magazines there, and I work with their designers. I'm there once a month, and I'm dealing with them almost every day, working on their projects. And I've been producing more books. So the Modern magazine came out 3 years ago, and that was a more general overview of what was happening at the time. And then more recently, I published Independence, which was a series of 12 interviews with independent magazine makers, and this is more about how they made their magazines, and we did 12 different covers, each one based on the front cover of one of the magazines. The book, The Modern Magazine, inspired a conference that continues today. Initially, it was just a one-off event that we held at Central St. Martin's, a part of the University of Arts, London. So that was in 2013. We held the first one, and we've been holding it annually ever since. In 2016, last year, it was back at CSM, and we feature, and this is something that's really close to my heart in terms of the approaches to magazines. What appeals to me about the discussion we're going to have now is that everything that we do covers all sorts of different types of magazines. So whether it's a really small independent magazine like Ladybeard, or indeed the Real Review, which had just launched, and this is the editor of the Real Review, and he had just published his first issue, but I gave him a platform to talk about it because I thought it was an important magazine. But then we also have sort of historical people. This is the original art director of Private Eye magazine, the British satirical magazine. And then we also have big names. In this case, last year we had Gail Bishler from the New York Times join us. And off the back of that, we produced a little kind of souvenir for everyone. So on the day, we had a team of journalists and team of people creating content, reflecting the day. And of course, the idea was that we would publish it about 2 weeks after the conference. So this conference took place last October, and we finally published this in September this year. So it's about 10 months after the conference. But we had fun with this. So we actually created, there were 12 speakers on the day, and we created 12 little mini magazines, each one of which was designed to look like a magazine. So they're all proportional versions of the real magazine. So what we were demonstrating is the different sizes, the different formats, and also we also mimic the papers that all the magazines use. So there's a set of 12 little mini magazines, each one reporting on the talk that the representative from that magazine had made that day. Is it going to change? Yep. Quick plug, this year the Modern magazine takes place in a couple of weeks' time. We have a fantastic lineup, including Francesco Franchi, who's coming to London to speak. And then finally, just to tell you a little bit about the shop that we opened. We took over an old newsagent or kiosk in Clerkenwell. This is what the shop space when we moved in. Well, more accurately, this is the shop space when we moved in. We quickly discovered that underneath that horrible plastic floor, there was an amazing piece of terrazzo covering the whole floor from the original build in 1958. Then that's become part of our identity. So this is the shop now. We had fun creating a bunch of little characters that we use in the shop and on publicity. We combined them with the floor to create a series of postcards and promotional items. And we use the floor as the background for our Instagram page. So we sell in the shop, we sell online all around the world, and the Instagram feed it gives you a regular update of what the new stock is. And the shop itself is designed to show off magazines in their best light. So it's very consciously designed to everything's shown full frontal. It's not laid over each other. It's gallery-like in its tone, and we encourage people to come in and look at stuff and appreciate stuff. Perhaps you've been to Do You Read Me in Berlin. It's very, very much inspired by that. We also hold events there. It's big enough that we can hold events. We clear the middle of the room, and the big shelf moves back on wheels, so we can have about 50 people come in. And we just launched the redesign of the art magazine Elephant. And this is the big shelf. So this gives you an idea how we present stuff. And just to give you a very quick overview of what the magazines are, they are magazines from all over the world. Of course, primarily Britain and Europe, where there's a huge burgeoning scene of independent publishing, as I'm sure you're aware, and where largely the language used is English. But we also carry magazines from as far afield as, English language territories like, America and Australia, but also Singapore, India, China. There's a lot of magazines being made now, and we're trying to kind of get stuff from as many different places as possible. They have to be of a certain standard. We have about 450 magazines in stock at present. If I said yes to every magazine that emailed me and asked me to sell it, I'd probably need 3 times the space. So it's a very, very harsh decision-making process. It's not, we can't take every magazine, so we only take the best magazine. And in case anyone's unsure about who's making these magazines, they're being made by young people, they're being read by young people, they're about everything. They're about everything that magazines have ever been about. There are fashion magazines, of course, food, design, architecture. There's some very conceptual magazines. There's some very interesting news magazines. It's a very vibrant scene, and the shop reflects that. And with that note, I shall sit down and shut up. But thank you for listening. And I would just...
Thank you. And now the third person that is going to introduce himself is Francesco. I don't know if he's going to speak in English or in Italian. I think that you should speak in English so we can...
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk about my recent project. Since 1 year, I started to work at La Repubblica, which is one of the leading newspapers in Italy. And before that, I have worked for 8 years for Il Sole 24 Ore in Milan. I think it's a challenging moment for a designer to be working in a newspaper because, as you can see, this is the newsroom in Rome. This is the meeting we have at the morning at 11 o'clock with the editor-in-chief. These are part of the newsroom, and I was saying that it's a very interesting moment for a designer to work in newsroom because in every newspaper is rethinking about strategies, is try to think about the role that the newspaper can have in the society. So in the recent year we tried to relaunch. This was the first project. We tried to relaunch the supplement, the cultural supplement that is in the newsstand during the Sunday. It's called Robinson, and with Robinson we try to start from the archive of La Repubblica. So we try to see, to analyze the type of the oldest issue of the newspaper. We try to find some elements, for example, the shadow, the use of the black, the use of the typography, and so we try to create this supplement that has a sort of vintage aspect, but as well as a very contemporary aspect, thanks to the illustration, thanks to the mixing of languages that you can find inside of the supplement. So we work a lot with the typography, starting from the first Bodoni that La Repubblica used in 1976. We introduced this typeface called the Sharp Grotesque, which is a huge family. As you can see, it's a family composed by a very condensed and thin, starting from a very condensed thin to an extended and black version. So thanks to this huge family, you can work with a sort of identity, a strong identity, but you can also work with a sort of variation inside of the layouts and the design of the covers. So we started from the grid of La Repubblica, and with Robinson we try to a bit to reinvent the format of the supplement inside of newspaper. So I try to bring it my experience inside of I learned inside of the magazine, moving, for example, the cover story in the central part of the supplement, and creating, because usually in a newspaper the cover story are the pages 2 and 3, 4 and 5, so it's usually at the front of the paper. Here we try to work like in a magazine, so create this huge cover story in the middle of the supplement. This is, for example, one limit I found designing Robinson, so designing a newspaper, is the editorial system. So in all the newspaper, they use this software that do not valorize a lot the graphic design, but try to valorize the time, because you have a strong deadline inside of the newspaper. So you have not a lot of freedom to design graphic inside of the newspaper. While in a magazine you can work a lot with graphic design. These are some of the front page of the supplement we designed. So working with different languages, so working with illustration, working with photography. This is the front, so you can see the references from the oldest issue of La Repubblica. So we work a lot with the type, with the grid. And the front of the magazine is, we try to work like in a book. So we have this huge column at the middle of the page. So we worked also with a big type, because our readership is quite old. So we try to keep the newspaper more readable. And these are some of the where we try to mix languages. So working with illustration, working with images, working with infographic, comics. So we try to introduce new languages inside of the newspaper. So you can see these are works done by Agostino Iacurci or Anna Parini, Maria Corte, who is a Spanish illustrator. And as well, we try to work a lot. For example, we can see, I try to skip a bit, we can see this is the cover story. So we try to work like in a magazine, like I told before, working with type, creating a huge opener section. And for example, we try always to follow the graphic style of the cover inside of the cover story. This was about 76, 77. This was about Gramsci, so how important is the role of Gramsci around the world. So we illustrated the different portraits of Gramsci coming from different parts of the world. This is all with Agostino Iacurci. It's a cover story about Europe. So we try to valorize the huge format of the paper with the graphic design. This was a cover story about the design, the role of the object in the everyday life, and these are other example of the supplement. This is one of my favorite issue about bikes. So the idea was to create a product that the people can keep during the week. We try to add quality. We try to, because I think, I believe in paper, and I think paper is becoming a sort of luxury. So the idea is to work with quality in a printed product. So these are some of the recent cover we designed. So you can see different styles. This was a sort of vintage issue about Maria Callas. And the second part of the magazine, so we try to create a sort of rhythm inside of the supplement, and the second part is more similar to a newspaper. So we work a lot with layout, is a part related to reviews of books, of exhibition. And again, in this part of the supplement, we try to valorize the design of the covers of the books. So we We are shooting always the cover of the books. Sometimes we work with illustration as well. So this is a more layouted part of the supplement. And this is the final part with the different charts about books. Another project we did at La Repubblica is a Super 8. Super 8 is a sort of long format reading, so we work with long text and with about reportage, stories. So are 8 pages. It's a weekly, so every Friday together with the newspaper. And we try to create a product for, again, to valorize the stories, to valorize long format journalism. And again, we work a lot with the text, with the white, and with the images. So I think it's a good moment, like I told you before, to work in a newspaper. We still believe in paper, and hope you will see soon other projects coming from La Repubblica. Thanks.
I don't know whether, oh, this is working. Okay, we can go with the short reel of this. I'm not going to present Wired, I just leave it back behind and I will start the discussion, then we can just stop it. Just to remind you what Wired Italia is for the people that never bought one copy. And this is one of the works that I do. And I gave already a speech yesterday, so I don't want to repeat that. And I want to leave the space for the discussion. But anyway, what you see here is one of the works the studio that I lead is doing, is Wired Italia. It's been a quite successful project. We started in the end of 2015, and I enjoy doing that a lot. I'm not going to talk about that much, but you can see a few issues here. What we like to do, we work on the project with David Moretti, which is the creative director of Wired US in San Francisco, and we work together any 3 months. The magazine is a quarterly, so it's out any 3 months every season, and what we mainly do is to involve as many artists as we can for every single issue. Has changed dramatically from what it was Wired before, when it was a monthly magazine, because now there's more space for reading, and is less related to information. It's more about essays, and so we give also with the layout more time for the reader to and more clarity. It seems more like a book than a magazine, if you want. And this is not something that we invented from scratch. There's already a long trend that is doing that and dealing with that when it's about the possibility to actually read essays. And nowadays, what I'm starting to say here, but it will be also probably one of the subjects we will talk later on, is that information is normally coming from a digital world. It's not coming from the newspapers anymore. Newspapers are really relevant for the essays, so the point of view of the journalist. So that's why Repubblica, Corriere della Sera, La Stampa, and the others are still relevant, because you don't want just to know what happened. You want to know the opinion of the people that are talking to you, and to share them with you, and to understand better with a more deep concern. I mean, with a different approach than just reading the news on an iPhone. So I think that Wired Italia is on that idea of forgetting about the news. There's a website. Wired has a website which is a daily source for information, and not just a daily, like an hour, every time, every second there's news, and you can get the news from there. But, and of course the subject is technology, innovation, and that, so there's very less politics. But the magazine became even more relevant in these times because apart from the website, you can have all the other informations there on the app and whatever, but you can still, every 3 months, every season, have time to maybe focus on some subjects, which each and every time are the title of the magazine. It's like it was a book. So the last issue was about limits, boundaries, and that was the subject. We started with Revolution, with works with Vincent Fournier or Mattia Balsamini or other artists that we work with, and that's it. So I don't want to make the long story, a long story out of this, because you can see it there. We can also stop it now. If you want to know more, buy the copy on the newsstands, do something for the people. I'm very happy that it's not possible to subscribe to Wired at the moment, because I like the people actually go to the newsstand to buy it, and I think this is something also that I, as a reader and as a person that lives in my time in Milan, I like the newsstands. I like to go there and meet with people and maybe have a little chat when I buy my newspaper or my magazine, and I think that is kind of a value, something that is important to keep. Maybe I'm a bit nostalgic if you want, but I think there's a value on going to the newsstand and buy the newspaper or the magazine or whatever it is. The last thing that you saw are the letters that we use, the numbers that we use for the chapters. So Wired Italia is really divided as a book in chapters, which is something that we like a lot, and we also put a lot of effort on designing each and every number, for each and every issue, the numbers and so on. So there's also a little nerdy attitude, if you want, after that. Okay, so we're fine with that, I think. And I will start maybe with a question. And I have the first question for Francesco, because I know that first of all I should probably give a little explanation. The reason why the panel is organized in this way, we had a chat with Fabio Guida before starting this, when he was organizing the graphic days, about what this panel should be like. And I had a chance to meet the people that you see here, and they come from different environments, and they all do publishing and design and related to magazine. And I like the fact that there's very different experience on this set today, on this group. And the experience of Francesco is very interesting, because the magazine you do are always related to a newspaper, which is something that that is very particular. I think there's something related to also the attitude that the journalist has toward the daily news and something which is like a weekly or a magazine or a monthly magazine. So I want to ask you, in your experience with Il and now with Robinson, and also in your experience day by day in the newspaper, what is the role of a designer inside, and what is the change that you are bringing there as a designer?
But I started my experience in a studio, in a design studio in Milan, when I was young, when I was at the university. And after 5 years I moved to a newsroom. I remember when they called me from Il Sole 24 Ore, I was a bit scared to go inside the newsroom, because I think, like a designer, you imagine a newsroom like a very boring environment, so maybe quite old, not very open to the innovation, while with Il Magazine I found another environment. So I found a place where like a designer had the possibility to express myself, and I think a designer speaks with the work is able to create. So I was very lucky, I think, and this is one of the most important aspects of the newspaper, to find people coming from different background that maybe they do not teach you about, but also a bit, yes, but they do not teach you about graphic design, but they teach you about journalism, they teach you about how to organize the things on a page, how to create a story, how to visualize a content. And also, I think that working in a newsroom, you got a lot of influences from everywhere. And you see, and this is a very, very strong aspect, you see how the newspaper are created. So I think that nowadays we focus a lot on algorithm, on venues, but I think the core of a newspaper, it's not an algorithm about how to get advertising, but are the journalistic ideas. And to have a very good journalistic idea, you have to create an environment inside the newsroom that is based on optimism, is creative, and I can see that nowadays, for example, at La Repubblica, I found a very nice place to work. I'm working with Mario Calabresi, the editor-in-chief. I work with Angelo Rinaldi, who is the art director of La Repubblica. So you can find a lot of experience coming from the years that they spent inside the newspaper, so you can learn a lot from them, and you can also try to innovate a bit, working with the contemporaneity and working with the design.
Of course, anyone is allowed to make questions, you and also from the floor, from the group here. So, but I will keep making a question to the other two invited. About what came in my mind when Francesco was talking, and which is for people of my age, which are very few around here, is a subject that has been already very important in the graphic design debate, and it's about the graphic designers, or as author, as producer of content. And I think that what we are dealing with today also, and I'm also thinking about the presentation that Ben was giving as a publisher also, is exactly also about this role of designer as author. And I think it's quite interesting because in my mind it's very important that the designer accept this role, but also it takes a responsibility, and it's very important to know that. I don't know whether if you want to talk about it or answer, or you think.
I mean, I could easily have mentioned that when I was speaking. I think that's again one of the reasons that appealed to me about editorial design above and beyond other forms of graphic design, is the role that you have in being very. Even the most junior designer is very close up to the creation of content and has access to reaching a point where you are making content, and that's the key to it to me. Is being responsible for both making and presenting the material.
Oh, hi, can you hear me? Great. I mean, this has been my kind of, I would say that I'm probably a visual artist who works using publishing as a medium. I studied graphic design for about 3 years, and I realized that I don't really care at all about fonts or grids or graphic design as a thing. I very much care about culture and messages and how that's communicated. That's always been my interest. So when I was studying, I kind of noticed that there's this world of graphic designers who kind of want to be artists or kind of want to be something else. And I don't find it interesting at all. I think the graphic design is a really valuable tool. Like, it's a really interesting, valuable tool, but it is a tool. That's it. It's a tool. And I think as designers, working as a designer, we have a responsibility to communicate a message. It's not even a responsibility. I think you can do whatever you want as a graphic designer, but I think a good graphic designer would be really, the paramount thing would be trying to communicate a message in the way that the person who created that content wants it to be communicated. So then if you step outside of that, you're not really being a graphic designer anymore, I think. I think that it's, I would say that I'm somebody who works with graphic design sometimes, but I have a long history of working in journalism and writing and creating content, and I found it quite, during my educational experience, seeing sort of books that graphic designers were making about fonts or bread or bus stops or whatever, like, I don't really care at all. But if you as a graphic designer go and study history or reportage or, or whatever, and kind of become involved in a context, and then have something to communicate about that, you're not functioning as a graphic designer, you're a graphic designer and a something else, and a historian, and an author, and a comic book artist, or whatever that is. And I think that that's something that I've seen it sort of drifting in that direction, because I think graphic design used to be something a bit like a pop star, graphic designers were internationally respected, and actually it's gone away a lot. Now when we're working as graphic designers, we're doing a job and providing a service, and actually that's not so glamorous. So I think that the way I see it is that people are trying to make it more glamorous by becoming authors or artists or graphic designers as artists, and for me, I think it's diluted the sort of purity of graphic design as a tool, and how amazing that is. It is an amazing thing, but that's enough in itself. It's enough to be an incredible graphic designer without having to be a graphic designer who also is a fine artist and an XYZ. So that's just my, of course that's just my opinion, but that's, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting point of view, because I think that when graphic design is, as you said, is a service, and when you do your job in a very efficient way, of course you make the best service possible. But I also think that there's something that you can add. Yesterday, I don't know whether you were here or not, but there was a presentation that Alexander Tomikowski, which is there, and I pronounced his name probably very bad, but Sasha, because now we're friends, and he gave a presentation of of different magazines designed by Herb Lubalin. And when I saw what he did, I thought exactly what you said, that Lubalin did the best service to the editor, but in the meantime, it just didn't fulfill the task. It just had something in terms of capacity to bring the content, deliver the content to the reader. And I think that when a designer can fulfill the task, the goal, and add something, which is not, of course, saying something different from the message, of course, but is able to speed up the message and to deliver to the reader very soon, is fantastic. Yesterday we saw a presentation about infographics, info design, and I sometimes feel that when you do visual data visualization, sometimes you don't speed up the message, you just slow down the message. There's some cases where the service could be to themselves. It's like a kind of visual masturbation, if you can excuse me, and I think that this is exactly what we don't want to do, but it shouldn't happen. But anyway, apart from that, I think that what is interesting, before someone of you, I don't remember who, was talking about paper as a luxury, so magazine as a luxury, maybe Francesco. And I think that, yeah, if you consider the market, is the market of paper magazine, of course, is reducing in terms of the amount of copies sold by the same magazine. I'm not sure that is reduced in general, because there's so many different, there's such a big, colorful palette of magazine. We saw McCulture, and the shelf there is fantastic. But maybe they sell very little copies, but there's much more, many more. So I'm thinking, are we going in a direction where the luxury will become even more luxury, and there will be less and less paper magazine? Or is it something, we are in a transition moment. Of course, nobody will know about the future, but what is, in your opinion?
I think it has to a degree become, you can call it luxury, but I think the other side of it is actually that we ended up in a situation where there were too many magazines and they became commoditized. There were too many magazines that were too similar to each other. So it's not so much, I think, that the magazines we're looking at now are luxury per se, although a number of them are. I think it's more that there's more inherent value in them because they're slightly more precious and they're a bit more responsibly made in terms of the volumes that they're made. I'm not sure about the business model of the magazine, the mainstream, the big business magazines that you have in this country, but in the UK, the fundamental model is that for every 100 magazines that you produce for the newsstand, 40 get sold and 60 get pulped. And that's an unsustainable model, full stop. So that's a huge amount of wastage, even if you account for some degree of recycling. But the amount of energy that goes into preparing the paper and running the print presses, delivering all that paper, is a complete waste. So if you can invest more value in the magazines that there are, then I think it's great that they're a luxury and that they're valued, they're kept. They're regarded as important documents rather than a piece of entertainment to be thrown out at the end of the week.
No, and I also think that you have to think in relation of time, because time as well is a luxury. So, for example, you have to think about so you have the hour, the day, the week, the month. So when you are thinking about designing a product that has to tell about news, you have also to consider this amount of time. So you have to think that maybe you have to focus on a product for the hour, on a product for the week, on a product for the time, or maybe when you're designing a paper, you can think about mixing these timelines together. So this is, I think, the key to try to rethink about the role of the newspaper and the design inside of the newspaper.
Yeah, I think also what you do professionally is there's nothing kind of frivolous about it. You're designing something really to communicate a very direct message that most people in a country would want to be engaged with, whereas a lot of the magazines that we're talking about, where people are printing 500 or 1,000, they're very, very particular interests. So they're for, very niche fashion magazines or with very niche sort of specific audiences, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think the good thing with that is that it becomes self-editing, because it's so difficult and expensive and time-consuming to do that, to make the energy to do it, that actually there might be a moment in time where there are thousands of new magazines, but then they don't last very long because people don't buy all of them, and it kind of, it becomes a trend, and then it goes back down to something a bit more sustainable. But also I think what magazines have now that they never had before is they're considered artifacts. Do you know what I mean? We can consume the information in many ways that don't cost much money, digitally. But I think that now everything that we buy physically, we see it as some kind of luxury or some kind of investment in an artifact. And we wouldn't have had that thought process 10 years ago. I think that magazines now are where the music industry was about 10 years ago. Publishing is quite slow. Book publishing has been very slow compared to music publishing. And I think that really, if you look at what's happened with music, that's really being replicated across magazine publishing. And I think there are people buying records in huge numbers now, but they're buying fewer of more diverse records in more specific subcultures. And I think that's the same. I think it's different with what we're talking about with your newspaper that you work on. In the UK, there is a magazine called Private Eye, and they sell hundreds of thousands still because it's fulfilling a very specific journalistic need that you can't get on the internet. And it's kind of long-form journalism that's difficult to read from a screen and all kinds of other considerations, but they're different considerations. I think people aren't buying that as an artifact, they're buying it as a means of consuming the information.
I want to invite people, and I'm happy that I don't have to invite more.
I wanted to introduce a subject to the conversation because I think it fits very well in this moment, which is that of the durability of content. which apart from the magazine as a luxury, I think helps magazines to survive. Also, I think we are attending, we're seeing a sort of natural selection of printed publications, where those more linked to seasonal content are now switching to digital, while those that host and contain more durable content still survive. And I think it's interesting what Wired Italia has done, switching from monthly, it was monthly, right, to quarterly. And also in the form, it adopted the form more of a book, also in the content, in type of content, and we see that many independent magazines also have this kind of form now. They're maybe biannual rather than monthly, like more commercial publications are. And we see that in Italy as well, now that Condé Nast is switching heavily to digital, and also Esquire just landed in Italy with the first, well, it wasn't published in Italy before, and it went straight to digital, for example. So just would like to have your opinion on this, on the durability of content.
I can give you a quick opinion on this. I think that magazines are ephemeral, and I think that everything about magazines and the whole world is ephemeral. So at the point at which it stops being ephemeral, it stops being a magazine and becomes a book in, you know, a saddle stitch form or whatever. And we're seeing a bit of a crossover with that, like Monocle are bringing out these kind of, I can't remember what they call them, but they feel like it could be a book. It could be a kind of Phaidon city guide type book, but it's disguised as a magazine. So when it's not ephemeral, I think it's kind of stops being a book. And also, in terms of biannual magazines, a lot of the fashion, it can exist digitally, but the printed magazines, especially in fashion, still have a very much higher currency. People won't produce photo shoots for digital content and spend the same money. Models won't model for stuff, and photographers won't work for stuff that's just purely digital. And they still, like, just it being in print, even if only 1,000 people are buying it, which is the case with a lot of very good fashion magazines, it still has a much more sort of elevated currency, I think. I don't know why, but I think it does.
I mean, I think there's plenty of reasons why the case. Largely, I think. I see it with people, young people I work with. So maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, students and graduates would leave university, and all they wanted to do was build websites and apps and whatever. There was, you know, that was the big thing. That was the different thing. That was the thing that they were excited by. That's changed now. I mean, everybody's interested in all sorts of things, but there's no big majority who want to go digital. People want to make print. If they're interested in kind of information and presentation and editorial, they want to work in print. The internet has become such a sort of basic, fundamental thing that we all take advantage of and rely on. You can be using whichever social media or platform or digital form you want. You just take that for granted. Print is something special, and it goes back to that point about luxury. It's something people set aside time to spend with print in a way that you don't with your phone. Your phone is just there the whole time. So we have customers come in and they're buying something for the weekend, and they go home and they'll switch off everything and they sit down and they read, and it's like reading a book. You disappear into it. You're not getting email notifications and WhatsApp banging in your face the whole time. There's a role for it in that sense. So in that sense, there is definitely a durability.
Yeah, I think that what is also interesting is that we're talking about magazine, but we could talk about our life and how will our life change during the years and future. And of course, nobody has a clue about what is going to happen in 5 years, but in the meantime, I must admit that what I see is the use of time that kind of changed in the last years. I mean, I normally now don't buy a newspaper during the week. When I buy a newspaper during the week, I buy it for my weekend, because I keep some time in the weekend to spend reading. while before I was reading a little bit every day, with the idea that in the evening I would have time to read the rest of the newspaper, and then the newspaper was there. Just the time that I used to spend was the time that I was having breakfast, maybe. And so there were like 2 or 3 articles that I could have a glance to.
No, yes, but okay, but people, for example, they have time to go on Facebook every day, and they spend a lot of time on Facebook every day. So I think can be a question of time, but I think mostly it's a question of the role that the newspaper maybe lost among the young generation. Because if I think to my parents, maybe my parents, they bought the newspaper because they wanted to read an opinion from people of their ages on a newspaper. So they wanted to read about ideas. For example, nowadays I don't buy a newspaper because I want to read an opinion from a guy from my age, because there are no journalists of my age writing opinion on a newspaper. So they move this axis of opinion, so it's just for people older than me. So maybe we have to focus also on this aspect, so that the brand of a newspaper is still important, but they are losing this sort of the power to create a community, for example.
Yeah.
But I think what used to the newspaper's previous role was it was invested in veracity and truth and speed, because actually printing something overnight and delivering it first thing in the morning was as fast as you could get. Now they're a much better medium for doing both. Certainly speed, veracity is the whole issue around the digital side, but nonetheless we get our headlines from our phone now. And I've completely forgotten where I was going with that. There was just disappeared. Sorry.
Doesn't matter. But at the moment, it appeared something that I was saying before that I forgot. So that's kind of a ping pong between me and you. But no, when I was talking about the time, is interesting, because in my life nowadays I find more time to read because I want to, and even if I buy less newspapers, I read more because I keep that in the weekend and I read different newspapers in the same day. Maybe I buy an international newspaper. I don't even buy an Italian one, but also I buy maybe a Repubblica because I'm interested in this weekly Robinson or something like that. So I take more time. It's also a different approach to reading, which I kind of like the most. I don't read any news online, actually.
What I was going to say, I've remembered now, kind of builds on that, and the opposite side of the fence from newspapers selling less or struggling or trying to keep up is the weekly news magazines. They are having the time of they're selling more copies than ever. We mentioned Private Eye, that very UK centric. It's selling more copies every 2 weeks than it has since it launched in the 60s, because I mean, it happens to come out in this absurd kind of 2 weekly, fortnightly regularity. But that and the weeklies are able to take a little bit more time to come up with this little bit more investigative opinion and offer it as a more, better than Twitter, better and better than newspapers. So that it's very hard to predict what's going to happen, because everyone thought the news weeklies were going to be dead, but they're selling more than ever.
I think there's a bit of a danger as well of us romanticizing what used to happen. I think that we like to think that 20 years ago, all of us were spending all of our time reading kind of long for. Actually, when I was younger, I spent a huge amount of time being bored and doing stupid stuff, and I think a lot of other people do as well. I think the number of people who are actually curious about the world and invest time in finding out what's going on maybe hasn't changed. It's just the channels through which they get it. And actually the people who are now spending all of their time on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, which is, partly me, but, those people maybe 20 years ago would have just been skateboarding or playing football or whatever else. I don't necessarily think that a lot of investment has been taken out of information. I just think it's being directed differently. And also, I mean, I don't know about you, but if I want to know what's happening immediately, I will go to Twitter straight away. But I don't trust what I read at all, coming from anyone. So it's the first point for news, where maybe, you know, the news on television was 15 years ago. But actually, when something's printed, somebody has invested literally money, but also their reputation in what's on the, on the page, because we have libel laws and litigation and all of that stuff. And if you write a tweet that's not true, you can just delete it. Yeah. You can't do that with a piece of print.
Once it's printed, it has to be true. Yeah. Well, it doesn't, well, you're going to have to stand by it. You can't change it.
Should be, yeah.
You can't end an article on Repubblica with ... as real Trump does every time with this tweet. I want to, if there's any question from the floor, I would be more than happy to leave the microphone to someone else. Just wave your hands. Oh, yes.
Do you think we need to train also the readers in what you are doing? I mean, I think that reading Robinson is also a kind of training for the final users of the newspaper, because it's something that is not usual to see. And finding this kind of typography, this kind of graphics, it's a kind of training process to get used. I mean, this kind of user to a different product.
No, yes, but funny things that I saw that young people, they're not able anymore to take to keep a newspaper in their hands on the tube or on the bus. So maybe we can organize workshop about that. No, I think. No, I think that when you design a new product, maybe you have also to think about to relaunch the actual situation. So maybe I think this is a good moment in Italy, because all the huge companies, so il Corriere della Sera, Repubblica, they're still believing in paper, and they're designing new printed products. So I think it's a good moment because when once starts to design something new, you create a new market, and you try to relaunch the market. So I think this is good, and if you try also to invest in the design, and so to valorize the typography, and that's good, because also other people, maybe they can see you, and they try to start to do better than you.
I just wanted to say something about this idea of training the target, or the reader, or the audience. That normally is exactly the opposite. What happens is the audience that is training the designers to do their job better, and because the audience is always challenging, is always changing, is always asking for something different, because technology is changing, because the taste changes over time, and so it is always a challenge for the designer. And I think that good designers should challenge themselves and train themselves in order to fulfill the necessity and the demands coming from the audience. In the meantime, I just want to add another subject to the discussion, because there is also, you said that the big groups like Corriere della Sera, Repubblica, and L'Espresso are still believe in paper, and I just want to add a little thing in the process, which is maybe they still believe in paper because the investors believe in paper. Because when you have like huge investment from advertising, and they want the paper to be there, of course you need to believe in paper. Now, I tell this story because when Condé Nast you were talking about, and of course, I hope will this be recorded? Is this recorded? Yes. Okay, can you cut this? Okay, I'll tell you a story. I will not talk about any publisher. I'll tell you, I just invent a publisher. There's a publisher that has a magazine, and decides to quit the magazine. And then the investors come to him and say, oh, are you really quitting the magazine? We are not going to invest on the website, we are not going to invest on your events if you don't have a magazine, because the value of this brand comes from the paper magazine. And that's why we give you the money. So if you don't have the paper magazine, and you just have the website, and you have the ability to organize fantastic events, we don't give you the money. So it's up to you. You want to quit it, or you start again. You start another thing. So, I mean, that also the reason why publishers believe in paper at the moment is that because the investors, the advertising people, believe in paper, because from paper becomes the value of a brand. So any magazine or newspaper, like Wallpaper or Monocle or the others, created their value around this object, which is paper. If tomorrow Wallpaper will only do the guide for the city guides and the website and so on, without having the paper magazine, it will probably change the investments. So I think that also what is leading, and Ben was talking about the fact that when he started he had a fanzine and they didn't have advertising, so they had huge space to express themselves, but also issues, and they have to quit because there were no money involved, so he had to find a job. I think that the main reason why we do magazine is because there's people involved, not in the beginning, because sometimes you do a magazine, you're a student, you do your own magazine because you want to express yourself. But the magazine that still sell in the newsstand are there because there's someone that wants to put advertising on them. Yeah.
I think just on that note, a print magazine is a bit of an anchor. So if you decide to scrap your print publication, then you can very easily change the function of your website. So if you have people who've invested in building up that brand, you could decide to make your website an online store very quickly, and people do at the moment. You know, they'll think, how can we reach a broader audience and get more clicks on the website? Okay, we'll start selling things. Then we start selling things on the front page. Then we scrap the journalism because it's not as profitable as the advertising, etc., etc. As long as you have that print publication, you can't go too far from your original mission, I think. And I mean, that's been especially notable with Vice magazine. Vice magazine, like, I mean, I don't know if anybody even still knows that the print magazine exists, but it's now this huge multinational corporation where it was 3 or 4 people in a room, and they're still making the print magazine, and nobody knows it exists. But it has to exist, because otherwise it just becomes some kind of ad agency, basically, I think.
It's that physical item again. That's the point, and it might only be in advertising meetings or investor meetings where you get it out and you slam it down the table, and it's a concrete thing that people can instantly understand. Whereas there's so much misunderstanding and misapprehension around digital clicks and figures and numbers, and it keeps coming out that it's all rubbish. The numbers are just going to just as and there's something still very reassuring about the printed item. The other thing I would add to that. This is cutting out. No, I would add to that is there is still, I think, a perceived kind of hierarchy of content, in the sense, I mean, a lot of the magazines that I see being launched by students and young people wanting to get a voice, they develop their voice online. They've learned through digital, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, or they've got a blog or a more sophisticated website, but they get interested in the subject, they start expressing themselves online, and the next step is, well, I'm going to go into print, because at that point that somehow it's a more serious endeavour. Still.
Any question? Any other question? No. There's a
So if you talk about the investor, about the magazine, when I was young, I studied the history of print, and I wrote a book about the underground press in Italy. And in these years, the word independent was very different from the word independence today, because independent was no publish, no the investor. It's our printing papers about changing time, and the distribution was in the streets. They fought for change things and other similar discussion. Today, the Independence was the magazine where you can see so many advertising, and so I would like to know what is the real definition of Independence magazine today. So this.
I think you're absolutely right. The word independent is meaningless. I think that it doesn't have more integrity just because it's made by some people who don't have a corporation funding them at all. And I think that a lot of the most valuable things in print now are not independent at all. And actually, it's kind of meaningless. And I think that you're absolutely right. People use the word independent to give something some sort of authenticity, because I think that they still. If there isn't lots of money behind it, that somehow it's more authentic. And actually, all of those people, I think a lot of the magazines that we now call independent would absolutely take money from Prada or Balenciaga or whoever, absolutely. The only reason they don't is because they're not offered it. So it's not in the spirit of the independent publishing that you're talking about. Actually, in the UK, we would call that kind of pamphleteering, or, zines, fanzines. Fanzines and zines are really homemade, photocopied by friends and given away for no money, or for a very, very small amount of money. And when you see a 500-page fashion magazine with, Gucci adverts and it's an independent magazine, it's bullshit, of course, So I don't care at all about the word independent. I think it's either good or bad. That's it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a meaningless term. But you have to have a term. In terms of having said that, if you're going to try and describe it, and I think what it comes down to is it's the people that are making the magazine are also making the financial decisions on the magazine. So they can decide to not make a profit or dream of making a profit, but then they're not doing. They don't have a finance department down the end of a corridor saying, no, you can't do this, is the point. They're free in the sense, they're as free as their mind is to do what they want to do. That said, granted, I think a lot of them aspire to be, not big corporations, but they aspire to be significant companies, and they're aspirational in their intent to make money and grow a business, and they're startups. They're very akin to the kind of whole digital startup ecosystems.
I had a question on the subject of audiences, which we picked up a bit, and just thinking about the difference between online media, which is going for the most number of clicks, and then delivering content to quite specific audiences. In your case, with a national newspaper, or 7 million Sky subscribers, or very, very niche kind of fashion people, about how you approach that kind of balance between speaking to your audience but also bringing them forward into something new. Someone else used the word educating them, or training your audience to appreciate something that they maybe haven't seen before.
That's a really interesting question, because magazines can do many things. Sometimes you want to, I mean, in plenty of examples that you appeal to the lowest common denominator to make as many sales as possible. And in other situations, perhaps you're trying to educate's maybe too strong a word, but you're trying to lift people and carry them with you. I think every magazine is different. Every magazine has a different role in that sense. What's common, I think, and it got crossed over in part of the discussion earlier. Magazines are fantastic at building groups of people with similar minds. That sort of, you end up using words like community and things like that, but they are kind of like mini clubs, and I think that's something that the new generation of small magazines have definitely been very good at doing, and I think it's something which the big publishers are beginning to remember, because magazines have always been great at building like-minded groups of people that want to do the same thing, they're interested in the same subject, they want to share it, they want to hear other people that share their passion, and that's always been the case. But I think in recent decades there's been so much money in advertising in the publishing industry that I think a lot of that has got forgotten in the rush to just increase your sales, and so everyone's chasing the same people, and the audiences in the mainstream publishing businesses get very promiscuous in terms of they'll pick whichever magazine they want off the shelf rather than being loyal to a magazine. And I think we're returning to that loyalty now, and I think Wired's a case of that, where so it's going to be quarterly, but and it'll probably sell less, but the people that buy it really, really want it, and they'll react to it and respond to it, and they'll be there again at the newsstand in 3 months' time. And that's the development that's happening, and that goes back to the ideas of luxury and it's going back to what magazines were good at in the first place.
But I think independence means also means niche, and I think that a huge group they probably have to learn something about the smallest group that are trying to launch all this new magazine, because sometimes, of course, we have a strong leadership among all these people. And our big question is how we can reach young people, how we can try to get more readers from other targets. Maybe we can learn from all these kind of independent titles, so we can try to focus a bit on some niches and try to sell other product together with a new product that keep that niche. That was one what we try to do with Robinson. So this is the problem of the target, but I think also another problem is about the online. So nowadays all the advertising works in a sort of with some metrics that maybe they're wrong, because if a newspaper needs to publish a column on the right side of your website with soft news, with galleries, so maybe there's something wrong, because you are trying to reach a lot of clicks, but maybe clicks is not the right metrics to sell advertising on the web. So the problem of the readership is something that all the huge group are they're making questions about that.
I think there's a very amazing thing that social media does, which is that when I was younger, a lot of the work that I do is about very, very small subcultures, and I find that fascinating. When I was younger, I could like a band, and the only other people who were interested in that band were in Canada or Australia or Japan, and we would never meet each other, and that was it. Now you can very easily build that, even if it's 200 people, which it sometimes is, you can build that audience very quickly online, find the tiny group of people who are very interested in that one thing, and then work with them or communicate with them or make a magazine with them or sell them a product. And that's really what I think, if you extrapolate that on a grand scale, that's what it can be useful for. If you take that as a mechanism for communicating stories in journalism, it's brilliant. But if you just think, I want to just expand my audience for no reason other than money or metrics, it's never worked. Do you know what I mean? It's never created a faithful audience. Faithful audiences for magazines have always been built on the relationship between the writers and the designers and the photographers and the readers, and that's why letters pages were so important. People writing letters to magazines, and people responding and printing them. It was a big part of that.
I'll just add, in terms of what you talk about with the digital side and social media, I think the big difference with the magazines, particularly with I think niche is a good word for it, is that 20, 30 years ago, if you published a small magazine in London, say, or indeed in Turin, you would try and distribute it locally, and you might get it to, in my case, Manchester, in your case, Milan or Rome, but you wouldn't look abroad to distribute it. But now, a lot of the kind of magazines that I'm selling, I know that that we sell a certain number in London, and then those same copies of the same magazines are in are in Amsterdam, they're in Berlin, they're in Barcelona, they're in Paris, they're in Milan, they're in similarly those niche. You know, you sell 100 in each capital city, suddenly you've sold 12,000. The other thing, just to pick up on what you're saying about the nature of the content and the messaging underlying the content, there are magazines now that are seeking to propose change. They're not being handed out free in the streets, but they're for sale, so they are part of a commercial operation. But there are a number of the kind of niche magazines we're selling, like Migrant Journal, Real Review. There's a whole host. I mean, Mushpit is one of them. There's a whole host of magazines being made by young women trying to change perceptions of just the next wave of feminism. There is a political voice within this as well. There is. It's not a majority. The majority are kind of quite aspirational lifestyle, fashion, etc. But there is, and I kind of thought perhaps there might be a little bit more by now, given the political turmoil that's going on, certainly in the States and in my country, in terms of, and I think Migrant Journal is a great example of a magazine that's been positioned into the European crisis. But it is there. It is there.
If there's no other questions, I think that we can also end the meeting now. I think the people is kind of leaving, but I know, because it's the end of the festival, not only of the day, but of course, if there's other questions, if they're worthy a public discussion, we can have it now, or maybe we can stay a little bit more here if you have direct question to make. And yeah, I think that it's been a very nice afternoon here talking about the magazine. Of course, I love magazine. We love magazine, so I quote my culture. And I hope we will be here maybe in a couple of years to talk about magazine in even a more positively environment. So maybe there will be a new magazine to talk about. Okay, so thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks, Francesco. Okay.